Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Ito, director of the MIT Media Lab, and this is another MLTalks. So anybody watching on the stream can tweet to hashtag MLTalks, and we will be taking questions. Today will be more of a conversation than a presentation. We have three of the Bitcoin Core developers. You guys can come up. Gavin Andresen, Cory Fields, and Wladimir van der Laan. Vlad is on Skype with no video, so he will be the voice of God. He is in Europe. But a couple things that we're going to start out saying is, I think there are enough, there's enough material out in the world about what is Bitcoin, and we have such an important topic here that we're not going to go through and describe what Bitcoin is. I see Michael in the audience. If anybody doesn't know what Bitcoin is, read Michael's book, The Age of Cryptocurrency. Stop watching this and then watch the video when it's posted later. But I think maybe we can first start out by the three of you guys sort of introducing yourselves and what you do, and then maybe we'll discuss what Bitcoin is after that. So, Gavin, do you want to start?
Sure. So my role has been changing. I was lead maintainer for the open source project. Wladimir is now lead maintainer for the open source project. I've tried to step back and think a little bit higher level, to think about the Bitcoin protocol and the way it should evolve, to think about Bitcoin governance and how that should evolve as Bitcoin gets bigger and more important in the world. So I spend my time thinking about that kind of stuff. So I actually spend a fair bit of time reading academic papers. Lately I've been looking at gossip networks and peer-to-peer protocols, because the Bitcoin gossip network and peer-to-peer protocol is pretty bad right now, and I think it could get a lot better. Thinking about information propagation across this peer-to-peer network we have, and then thinking about very practical, what do I need to do as a next step to actually make that happen, to actually get changes like that rolled out and to get people to adopt it. So I kind of skate that practice, theory to practice border and think about that kind of stuff.
I'm Cory Fields. I'm a Bitcoin Core software developer as well. So Gavin has kind of stepped back his role working on day-to-day stuff. So I have taken on some of the more mundane and boring and behind-the-scenes
and incredibly important
plumbing work so that people like Gavin don't have to. So I joined on doing some build system work, some release management, like doing the managing the process by which we actually release new versions of Bitcoin Core, which is, I think, much more complex than people realize. And that is kind of finalized and done these days, luckily. So I managed to shove my foot in the door, and I've since stuck around and been working on other interesting projects in Bitcoin Core.
And Vlad, do you want to?
Yes, I am Wladimir. My role is maintenance of the Bitcoin Core software, and a lot of major and minor tasks that come with this. It tends to keep me busy enough. I spend most time communicating with the open source contributors. So from reviewing code changes to providing support and how they can improve their code so that it can be merged into the Bitcoin Core. Well, what I also do is release management, so decide when the releases will be, what will be in the releases, and so on. And I spend a lot of time troubleshooting issues of different bugs and so on, and testing. And
one of the, I'm going to ask a question, then we'll talk about Bitcoin. But so, what does it mean to be a core developer, and like what I mean, what's the architecture of the group that you guys are in?
That depends on who you ask. So I've always, in the past, when I've said core developer, I mean one of the 5 people who has the ability to pull changes into the Bitcoin Core open source software project. So that's me, Wladimir, Peter Wolle, Greg Maxwell, or Jeff Garzik. So in the past, I've always said those are the core developers. Over time, that term has taken on a larger meaning. So lots of people who call themselves core developers if they contribute to the open source software project. I don't really care what people are called. I think it is more important to think about, what is the process for making changes. As Bitcoin gets bigger and we have more than one implementation of the Bitcoin protocol, how is that going to evolve? We started with the one true Bitcoin implementation given to us by Satoshi. Now there's at least 3 or 4 different implementations. The Bitcoin core software is still absolutely dominant on the network.
So why don't you go unpack that a little bit? So when you say Bitcoin, what are you talking about, and what are the different layers?
Yeah, there are 3 things I think of when I hear the word Bitcoin. One is Bitcoin the currency, right? This digital cash for the internet that you can use to pay for things. That's lowercase b Bitcoin. There's Bitcoin Core, the open source software project. That's the code that runs the Bitcoin network and that lets people trade this currency. And then at a higher level is Bitcoin the protocol. So theoretically, we will eventually move away from having this one implementation of the Bitcoin protocol. And we're right in kind of the middle of that transition, I think.
So when you say different implementations, you're not talking about the altcoins, which are like Bitcoin but not Bitcoin. You're talking about implementations that are from the core software project?
Yes, in the same way that when the web started, we had one implementation of the HTTP server and the HTTP client. Nowadays, there are dozens of implementations of HTTP servers and HTTP clients.
Right.
And you have the HTTP protocol, which is different. They all speak that protocol. And I think we'll get there with Bitcoin.
And right now we're kind of in the IE6 phase of things. So Bitcoin Core is pretty dominant on the network, just like Internet Explorer 6 at one point pretty much defined the internet. It was realistically your only real option. So we have there are complications in Bitcoin that make it harder to kind of branch off and move away. It's not as easy as someone coming along and saying I wrote a better one. But we're kind of in the process of trying to get away from, or I hope to anyway. I think people have different goals, but I would like to see us moving away from that the one true implementation that we have now.
So there's a software and then there's a protocol, right? And usually when you have like the IETF or whatever, they will, or the W3C, you argue about the protocol and you may do a reference, but the implementations are different organizations. But you're also writing the software, right? And then the different I guess maybe unpack kind of, because like Linux, you have the kernel is the kernel is the kernel, right? You don't have multiple implementations of that, the main kernel, right? So how do you separate out the protocol conversation with the software, or is it?
It's hard, and it's not really done that way at the moment, unfortunately. So everything is, I think, there are a select few people who absolutely see it as divided up into small chunks, but in general, I think that the discussion is mainly at a really big level. Those things grouped together. So there are efforts to break them up, but like you said, there's standards or specifications for the most part. What we go by is the reference code. That the Bitcoin Core, if you say how should I behave, what should I do in this case, look at the Bitcoin Core code and do that.
Yeah, that's what we started. We didn't start with a written protocol description, which a lot of other protocols do start with some high-level description of how the protocol should behave. We started with the code that Satoshi wrote, and we're kind of working backwards to figure out what the protocol is and to get rid of all of the nasty little corner cases that we're finding. And that's proceeding. That's getting better. I think that we are finding the corner cases. I think things are a lot better now than they were 2 or 3 years ago with respect to, weird little dependencies we have on the OpenSSL implementation, for example. So I think we are getting to a place where one could write a protocol specification document and have it be almost 100% correct.
But I think it's really important what you just said, that it's sort of backwards from many organizations. So for instance, I think you would imagine like MP3 or some of these others, you have industry that says we need a specification because we're building stuff. and the government's going to regulate the stuff. So we need a protocol that the government agrees with, that we can build, that's technically feasible. Let's build it, and then a whole bunch of people build software against that protocol. But since you're a software project, and then you push the software out, and then somehow it gets run by a bunch of different people in a bunch of different places, but at some level, if I'm not mistaken, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, you're really not regulated, first of all, because you're not an industry organization. And the extent to which you care whether people use it or not, you might care whether they're regulated, but like, technically speaking, you don't have to care what people think, right? Is that mischaracterizing the project?
We have a different challenge. The Bitcoin as a software project, or any software project that attempts to work with Bitcoin has a very interesting challenge that's really new to it. Definitely to me, I think to most software developers, which is that of consensus, where most coders are very used to the idea of I implement it this way, and if I get this answer, that it's wrong. In the Bitcoin world, the generally accepted answer is the correct answer, even if it's wrong, which is weird. So in the Bitcoin world, if 1 + 1 = 3 in this scenario, then you have to write your code as if 1 + 1 = 3. And that's obviously a terrible example, but it's the mindset that you have to get into. And so I think that's what makes a specification so hard, because in a lot of ways it's kind of a living, breathing thing. It's what the majority agrees upon is the correct answer.
And then when you say the majority, there's sort of how things get pulled into the code, and then how that code gets deployed, and then who runs the code. There's different layers of people that decide, right? So
right.
Can you kind of describe that process, for instance, of how you come up with a modification? Maybe walking through an example would be a good way to describe the different people who have to all agree before eventually I can use it on my app.
You or me?
Go for it, Cory.
So it depends on how controversial it is and how likely it is to rock the boat. So
maybe like check lock time verify would be a good example that's very relevant right now.
Right. Yeah. That is a new feature that just went into. We had a release just in the last week or so where a new feature was added, and so it's been discussed for years and years. It's a relatively slow process, I think, but it's ultimately it's discussed and debated publicly and privately, pretty much like you would imagine, because things do get a little bit politically charged, but for the most part, this is
on email though, mostly on the mailing list.
Pretty much,
yeah.
I would say everything is public. Bitcoiners are weird about things going kind of private and underground. So things do happen on the surface for the most part, but ultimately it lands in a pull request in Bitcoin Core, and where the code is debated and argued, and ultimately it's pulled in and it makes it into a new release. So in a lot of ways it's just like submitting a new feature to any other open source project that you might work with. Just like submitting a new feature to Chrome or Firefox or Linux, the Linux kernel or whatever. It follows very much the same workflow. But at the same time, if it is something that changes the ecosystem in a way, the person who is bringing it forward has to argue more than just code. They have to argue the impact of the thing, how it's going to be deployed, how things are going to look, what some of the kind of global drawbacks of it might be. Mm-hmm. So I would say for the most part, it's really just like a feature going into any other open source project.
Well, and features that change consensus, like check lock time verify, we do have a little bit more formal process so that you have to write out.
Describe what that is.
So we have these Bitcoin improvement proposals, BIPs. Check lock time verify is BIP 65, if I recall correctly. And so part of the process for anything that, I think of BIPs as being appropriate for anything that affects multiple implementations. So imagine that there were multiple implementations of the Bitcoin protocol. If some change to Bitcoin Core software would affect more than just the one implementation, it should have a BIP. It should describe this is the change
What
we're
does BIP
making.
stand for?
Bitcoin Improvement Proposal.
Okay.
It's modeled after Python's PEPs, and BitTorrents has BEPs, I think. So we have BIPs in the Bitcoin world. The similar process of, you write down what the protocol changes are. At the same time, the idea is that you should be writing an implementation. We don't really like to see BIPs that are just pie in the sky. I think this is a good idea. I really like the model of IETF of rough consensus and running code, where I like to emphasize running code, because I think whenever you implement something, you always discover stuff. So ideally, you have a BIP and implementation. The BIP gets discussed endlessly on Bitcoin Dev mailing list when there seems to be rough consensus that it's a good idea. You take that code that you wrote and you submit a pull request to the Bitcoin core. Now, I've called Bitcoin core the reference implementation for years, because that's what I see its role as. And the very fact that I've called it the reference implementation for a year implies that there would be other implementations. So that's where I personally see things going. And I see Bitcoin core as continuing to be the reference implementation for as long as people kind of trust it and trust the process of change to it.
But so let's say you go ahead and you guys on the mailing list decide this is a good modification, you make the change. Then what happens?
Then,
because you've got the reference sitting there, right?
You kind of have to sell it a little
Yeah.
bit. So for the most part, it makes it into a new release, and it's a bit of a point of contention. People tend to, or there are definitely groups of people who prefer to stay on older releases, because it would be easy for us to say, we fixed 100 bugs. There are 100 ways that we know that you can crash Bitcoin Core. And we also implemented this controversial feature. So if everybody really needs to deploy this now, so you don't end up crashing, but we're able to change the ecosystem as a result. So when we push out new versions, it's essentially we try to backport to lots of older versions. So we try to make it such that if you are very comfortable running the version of core, the code, if your network behavior and your consensus behavior is as you like it, we try to give you an option for here's just this edition if you want to add that. But then there are campaigns for why this is a good idea, why we think that you should be running this. So
when you say running, there's the people who mine Bitcoin, the miners, and there are also people who probably have wallets. There's a bunch of different people who run the software, but is it true that the miners are probably the most important group to sell on implementation for it to be?
It really is a balance. So for me, the miners in the exchanges really have a lot of control. The exchanges, because that's where miners cash out the bitcoins that they create. Right. So miners typically don't hold on to all the bitcoins they create, or don't spend all the bitcoins that they create. Eventually, if the Bitcoin economy was large enough, I assume miners would pay their employees in Bitcoin, and those employees would just buy products and services for Bitcoin, in which case it wouldn't be the exchanges that had the really important role. It would be the merchants who are accepting Bitcoin for payment, or ordinary people who are accepting Bitcoin for payment that would have that really important role. But right now in Bitcoin's life, I think it is kind of a balance between the miners and the merchants. They both have to agree that they're going to accept a consensus level change. If the miners agreed but the merchants didn't, they would be producing Bitcoins that they couldn't sell. If the merchants agreed but the miners didn't, then the feature just wouldn't happen. And so it really does take kind of an agreement among both of them.
So if the miners accept it but the merchants don't, and you have two different versions running, I suppose it depends on how different the versions are, but how does a network fail in that case?
If the miners accept it but the merchants don't?
Yeah, or do the miners just quickly roll back if they can? I mean, how does that work when you're rolling out?
Miners are highly incentivized to produce bitcoins that they can do something with.
Right.
So in that case, the miners, and this actually happened. We had an unfortunate hard fork where the miners were on upgraded faster than the merchants, and were producing blocks that a lot of merchants and exchanges wouldn't accept. So we had a chain fork. The miners were the ones who decided that they were going to roll back to the old version of the software, even though they lost Bitcoin from doing that. They realized it was in their best interest to go with the kind of economic majority blockchain. And so I think that incident showed that, miners are meta-rational. They understand that if they produce Bitcoins that nobody will accept, they're worthless.
So where does this conversation, this selling happen? Like, you guys are on your mailing list talking about the technical stuff. How do you know what the miners are thinking, what the exchanges are thinking? I mean, are they also in the mailing list arguing with you guys? Do they have their own developers?
Sometimes they are there. For the most part, for most technical changes, they don't really care. So it's always a challenge to get miners to upgrade. They would much rather not upgrade their software if they don't have to. I think part of that challenge is just giving them something that they want. So, making it faster, more efficient, use less CPU, use less network bandwidth, whatever. I think there has to be some reason for miners to upgrade, or they're likely to just say, no thanks, we're not going to. I mean, bug fixes are often the impetus, right? If there's some denial of service attack, they obviously don't want to be subject to that denial of service attack, so that will cause them to upgrade.
So you can package stuff.
So yeah, I think packaging stuff so that there's a little bit of a carrot to go along with whatever nifty new feature that's maybe good for merchants, but miners maybe couldn't care less. I think that's the way to do that.
But so is there some formal process? I'm sorry, I'm just dwelling on this, but I haven't seen it well documented. But what's the formal process by which you let the world know that they should be upgrading? And I mean, is it like Microsoft auto update that they just click OK, or?
I think at this point this is probably a good one for Wladimir, because this is kind of.
Vlad, are you there?
Yes. Yeah, what we do at the moment is just send a release announcement to the mailing list that there is a new version, what are the properties, the new features, the bug fixes described in the release announcements, and then people can decide whether they update or not.
So as far as it's funny that you mentioned auto update. So auto update gets brought up pretty often. The interesting thing there is that in a lot of ways upgrading is a choice and a bit of a vote. You're contributing to the network, whether it's the node that you're running, the wallet that you're running, or whatever. So it's not really possible for us to create a new version and kind of implore you to jump to the new one and say this is better, because we might have changed policy in the meantime.
But you guys probably want to know, though, before you do the release, whether people are not going to like it, right?
I think we have a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
With Reddit and the mailing list, and I think we have a pretty good idea of what is controversial, what's not, what do people like, what don't they. That's not hard.
So you've never really been surprised by how the network responded to a change?
Because also before a version is released, the source code is already available from the site. So there are already people that use the version before it is released. So if there is something controversial, then you will usually hear it way before the actual release.
There is an interesting dynamic in that the controversy tends to happen as soon as a change is pulled into the core code. So there may have been, a month or two of discussion beforehand, but until it actually hits the main source code repository, you don't necessarily see the controversy, which is a really interesting dynamic. It'd be nice to be able to fix that, but I don't know if there's any way of fixing that.
So I guess, because some people have said that Bitcoin is impossible to regulate because the people who are writing the software don't have to care what anybody else thinks. But that's not really true, listening to you. You do care whether it's going to be implemented, and then the people who are running the code, many of them are regulated. So the extent to which regulation impacts the ability for people to accept an upgrade, it's guiding
I mean,
you guys
of
do.
course we have to care, because otherwise we would be writing software for no one. And yeah, I mean, it's open source software, so other people could just pick it up and write the software as they do want it. So there is a compromise there, of course.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of feeling out of both developer opinions and kind of external opinions before you start. You know, if you're looking at working on something for a month or two, you know, a big feature, or you know, some hard to write code, or something that's hard to explain or document, obviously you want to put a good amount of time into actually making sure that you can sell that, or making sure that you can give it a good pitch before you commit yourself to it.
I guess though there is sort of a question, because you're still slightly under the radar and that there aren't that many regulations yet. But I mean, I think about the Tor project, for instance, which I love. But they're very strong about certain principles, and they, at some level, don't really care whether they're banned in certain countries, and that they don't really care that it's actually kind of hard to use. And so not too many people use Tor, but it's still one of the best tools for what they do. Compared to, yeah, go ahead. So I guess the question is, if some regulations started to come down, like more people, let's say, people who were considered bad to some people started using it a lot, and there was a regulation. I mean, is that the kind of conversations that you think? How do you think it'll play out? If
it's hard for me to imagine at the level that we work, like way down at the network protocol kind of consensus level. It's hard to imagine what regulations might affect us way down there. Yeah. I mean, the regulations are typically layered way on top. So I know lots of people are concerned about, you know, what if the core committers get swayed by regulators or put under threat of doing something, and it's not even clear, like if some government could somehow hold a gun to our heads, what would they ask us to do? It's not, we don't really have. And
even still, if Gavin submitted a pull request that was obviously, you know, stupid or limiting, or you know, something that everybody despised, he would know.
Right.
Oh, I've done that.
He would hear about it quickly, and it wouldn't matter if there was a gun to his head or not. Sorry, but
no, absolutely.
You know, it's not like anyone can just use their sway to say this is what we're doing now. This is in now. So in that sense, it really doesn't matter if regulators are you know, if you feel pressure from regulators or not.
And I think the regulators understand that, and I think law enforcement understands that. And if they don't understand that, I think they will very quickly.
Yeah, I think my personal opinion is I think it depends on how it proliferates and what the bad cases turn out to be. And I don't think we're there yet. And it may be that, I mean, but I do think that fundamentally, because you're open source, because the developers are all over the place and not in one group, it's a lot harder. I mean, I remember some of the closed protocols, like you know, GSM encryption and stuff, you did see NSA going in and trying to fiddle with it, and I think, you know, it's probably obviously different because everybody, it's all pretty public. But you know, you could, I guess, imagine though that there are some decisions that will have some level of influence on how somebody that's using the software may or may not be able to implement a regulation. And I think you could imagine a decision that you have to make about whether you're going to support a certain use of the code or not.
So we see that come up sometimes in anonymity discussions. Yeah. You know, whether this particular type of transaction, whether we should work further on allowing transactions to be entirely anonymous, whether that's a good thing or not. And so far, I think it's just come down to kind of personal preference and interest levels. I don't know if there were suddenly some consensus about getting this in and touting it as the big new thing, then at that point, you know, we might have some people knocking on our doors.
Because I think this is kind of, I guess this is where I'm kind of getting at, is because we had this a lot with when I was on ICANN about like who is privacy and stuff like that, and the problem I think is, in my view, that US expects a certain amount of transparency of transactions to follow their regulations about money laundering. But in other countries, I wouldn't want regimes to understand, to be able to track all of the transactions in Syria, in Iran, or some other places where I have friends who are dissidents, right? But the problem is, for any global standard, you can't apply the protocol or the standard sort of haphazardly. You push it out. And I think that's the meta problem, which is I think the privacy concerns versus the transparency concerns are sort of different depending on who's in charge. And I think I'm not positive that there's a really easy. I mean, Facebook actually deals with this in its own way, where I remember when they turned on a feature that allowed you to see people's friends. There was a huge storm, it was right around the election problems in Iran, and you didn't want the government to be able to know who your friends were, and I think they hadn't at the time thought through the repercussions of flipping that bit, and so I think that as it starts to proliferate, sort of the unintended consequences of changes become interesting, and I don't want to jinx it, but I think that the anonymity one will be one of those places where that sweet spot's going to be an important one to find.
I think that might be right. I mean, it depends on how it's done, right? I mean, to a certain extent, anonymity is a feature of a wallet, and right now we're actually pretty well, the kind of low-level protocol is pretty separated from how do you manage the keys, how does the reference Bitcoin Core, the reference implementation does have a wallet in it. As part of the reference implementation, although it's not a very good reference implementation wallet anymore. And it needs to be rewritten. And it needs to have better privacy. And it needs all these other features. But breaking that, if it was controversial to make that a lot more private, it would be easy to break that code out as its own separate project. If the low-level protocol, if we started talking about features meant just to enable privacy, I could see that as being controversial. I could also see it as being not controversial if those features have some other use, which, if they're just low-level cryptographic primitives, they probably would have some other use. And I think it's very easy to argue, this is not just about privacy.
And I think that's an important strategy, which is to make it so useful that when the debate starts, they can't just kill you. Because I think one of the problems is that, just take money laundering itself as a crime. What's wrong with money laundering? What's wrong with the fact that why can't I just give you a bunch of money and not tell anybody if I report it in my taxes and don't commit any crimes? It's a meta crime, right? So it's kind of, to me, it reminds me of anti-circumvention under DMCA because what happens is you're sort of killing the messenger to try to anticipate and preemptively prevent a crime or to make it easier to enforce. So even if you guys don't implement privacy, if your protocol enables somebody else to implement privacy in a way that can't be implemented anywhere else, I could see that is a derivative of the anti-money laundering law, which then is a derivative of running on your network. Because I remember people trying to shut down the internet at the beginning because they thought it enabled all these other things, even though the internet itself wasn't bad. And so I think that the risk is that even if you push the anonymity things up a layer or two, you're still enabling it. Just like money laundering itself doesn't feel like a crime, but it enables a whole bunch of crimes that people would like to crack down on. So I think and I do think that it's whether you can make yourself essential. Because a lot of people, when we first built the internet, like when I was working on the internet in Japan, when we first made the first internet service providers, all the lawyers wrote these big, huge papers about how it was illegal. How about having connectivity between countries that don't have bilateral agreements is fundamentally illegal. We must shut it down. And it just became useful fast enough so that they couldn't. But they would have if we didn't. And so I do think that that may be something important. Anyway, that's my personal.
There are a few altcoins that do at least purport to provide more privacy features. So they are like a canary in the mine. If the regulators want to go after something, you would expect those to be caught first.
So I know we don't want to talk about it too much, but I can't not talk a little bit about the block size thing. And I don't think we're going to have the argument here just for anybody who is looking forward to that. But I do, since everybody's been talking about it, I do want you guys to kind of describe what it is and put it into perspective and kind of describe where, I mean, you've been, Do you guys want to describe what, because I think some people understand what the debate is. I think some people misunderstand it, and some people have never heard of it. So maybe since it has been kind of an anomalously, interestingly focused on thing, I don't know if you guys...
So there's a problem that we have seen coming for years and years, and that we have this 1 megabyte block size limit that Satoshi added like a year after Bitcoin had been going. And that limits the number of transactions that the Bitcoin can process to somewhere between 3 and 7 transactions per second. Right now, we're running anywhere between like 2 and 4 transactions per second, depending on what's happening on the network. So we are starting to run into that limit. And there's a huge debate in the developer community about exactly how and when to raise the block size, to you know, what should we do exactly. There are 3 different BIPs right now, I think, proposing different methods for how to raise the block size. There's not yet consensus on exactly how that should happen, and there's not even really consensus on kind of, you know, how are we going to make this decision, right? If we can't all agree on a single BIP, who gets to decide? How do we decide? And so it's messy and divisive right now. I think the good news is that everybody agrees that this is a problem that needs to get solved. It needs to get solved pretty soon. I thought it should have been solved back in January. Other people think maybe it's okay to wait another 6 months. That's part of the debate, is just how critical a problem is this. And all this argument happens out in public, which I think makes which makes it harder, because anybody in the world can chime in and have an opinion, and everybody does. It's an easy subject to have an opinion about.
The issue is hard, and I would like to say what I wish more people would say, is that I don't understand it, and I don't pretend to. There are so many facets to it. There are so many different perspectives and variables and things that need to be that need to be analyzed and discussed. That I think the reason that it's such a kind of sexy and divisive issue is because it's really easy to take one and say, like, this thing matters. This is important to me, so I'm going to jump on this and. It can appear easy. You know, the problem seems to be blocks are too small. Here's a proposal to make blocks bigger. Problem solved. Why is it harder than that? But you know, like we were talking earlier, the kind of the core of Bitcoin. One of the interesting properties that it has, as far as the core the consensus part of it, is that what most people go by, what most people believe, or what rules most people use to verify things, is the kind of the de facto rule. So it's become a problem now that there are so many different ways that we can go, and there has to be one that wins. So it's kind of created factions and groups a little bit. So it's become a very overblown, or not necessarily overblown, but a very, very contentious issue, because there ultimately kind of has to be one that wins. And it's hard when there are other fun things going on.
So is this like the Nietzsche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or are you just getting tired out?
I hope it makes us stronger. I hope we come out of this with a better process for making these kinds of decisions going forward. I think that gets lost a little bit. I think this is a question of governance and process, and do we want to be like the IETF? Do we want to be more formal? Do we want to be less formal and just may the best implementation win? And whatever code people run, that's the answer. You know, how do we make it less contentious when we have this kind of decision to make in the future? And I don't know the answers to that. I'm hoping, actually, to get advice from people like you, who have been through this kind of thing before with other internet protocols, on, you know, how do we make it better? How can we make it smoother? I know it'll always be messy, but how do we have fewer hurt feelings if people, you know, either feel like they're not being heard, or feel like they didn't have the right process for expressing their opinions, or, you know, whatever, what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, your mileage may vary on this, but my personal opinion is that face-to-face meetings are tremendously important. And, again, ICANN is everyone's favorite thing to hate, but being on the board of ICANN, it's an interesting thing where you have like a week and you have all the different groups, like the registrars, the registries, there's the Government Advisory Council, which doesn't have power over ICANN, it just recommends, but you can listen to what they say. There's the intellectual property, the business, and then you have all these meetings between the different groups and then inside of the groups, and at the end, there's a board, you come up with resolutions, and then you have an open mic where everybody just talks for hours and hours and hours until everybody's so tired in the end that you just kind of, okay, and you sort of agree that you were all there when we decided. And I think that it's a combination of just kind of like being able to just say everything. And it is true that like you do have these slightly denial of service filibuster types where the regular people come up and and push their agendas, but you can kind of, if you have the patience, you can just sort of like
Wait them.
let them just vent. Because I think when you try to resist and fight back, it's kind of like trolls. Don't feed the trolls. You just let them play out. But the thing is, by making the ICANN meetings completely open and not preventing anybody from showing up, you eliminate that whole set of arguments that they weren't allowed to participate or that they weren't part of the conversation. You can always argue, wait, there was an open meeting, and you could have come and argued it, but again, there's different ways to do it. But that one, I think, for a particularly political and contentious set of problems, seems to work unusually well. And I think also by giving the government a seat at the table, but not a seat on the board, actually turned out. I mean, they don't have control. And calling it an advisory council rather than a board, I think was pretty important.
So who gets to choose who's on the ICANN board?
So each of the different groups select a certain number of people, and then there's independents as well. So it's a fairly funky system with a nominating. ICANN is like a big, humongous bureaucracy, but it's like each piece has been added for a reason, and it doesn't work perfectly. But one of the things it does seem to do is absorb tremendous amounts of drama without dying, which is, I've seen other things, I won't name names, but other, standards bodies just kind of wither under the kind of drama that we had to deal with at ICANN. I wouldn't wish ICANN on anybody, and I don't think that you necessarily want to do all of that right now, but I do think that this is kind of an interesting opportunity. Maybe this particular problem you don't have to, because it's been kind of kicked around a lot, but like having learned from this, maybe start to think about how to upgrade BIP, how to, we've been doing these scaling Bitcoin meetings, and I think it sounds like they've been pretty useful to have people talk about things, right? I don't know what if you have, maybe you should start with kind of thinking about how to run a meeting, and then build a structure that fits more about how the meetings are run rather than the other way around, because I think that structures are harder to change.
I think that, so we had one we had a scaling Bitcoin in Montreal recently, and there's another one coming up in Hong Kong. I think that the Montreal event was fantastic. I think that most people most of the devs that I've spoken to that were there pretty much agree. If only ignoring everything that happened, ignoring all of the presentations, the discussions, things that people learned. People have online personas that crumble in person, and so it's nice when you can walk away and say we clearly disagree on everything, but he's a nice guy. So that actually helps you when you get home and you're typing a really furious email and you realize there's no need to resort to attacks because I've met the guy. He's a nice guy.
Do you agree?
I hate traveling.
Clearly Vlad does too.
I know Vlad does too. I've met Vlad in person once or twice. We met in person, Vlad. Twice, I think.
Yes, at Amsterdam and in Montreal.
I met him twice.
Yeah. So the whole everybody gets together in person for multi-day meeting. I may have to step back and let other people take the reins on making these hard decisions, just because I'm not sure I personally want to do that.
And to be fair, the ICANN meeting shielded the technical people from those multi-days. So you had a board who was self-selected by people who were willing to put it. I called it jury duty. I felt like doing 3 years of ICANN was to pay the internet back for, sort of all these things that it provided me. But then the technical people had their own separate session, and they were basically shielded. And a lot of our job as the board was to prevent any of this from muddling the technical conversation.
So I'd vote for that. That sounds great.
I'm a really big fan of getting devs together and locking them in a room for a while. I've had great success with that in the past with other open source projects. The thing is, with open source projects in particular, it tends to be people connected from all over the world who never get any FaceTime, and who the really funny part is may not necessarily get anyone in their real lives to talk to about what they do. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you write a really neat feature, and you want to talk about it, and you try your friends and family, and they don't care. It's not interesting. So you find that when you get 10 or 20 people in the same room, you can't shut each other up. Everybody's so excited because everyone speaks your language. Mm-hmm. So those, in my experience, have been very productive and very fruitful. So I would love to see more kind of technical meetups.
I do think as Bitcoin matures, yes. I mean, the people who are using the software need to have more of a voice. But I think it's starting as an open source software project where everybody was a volunteer, everybody, it was geeks who are interested in this stuff, jump in and just do whatever interests them. I think as Bitcoin grows up and there are real businesses relying on Bitcoin, they need to have more of a voice, they need to have a little more control over what happens. And so I think that's another part of the evolution that needs to happen. It's not the developers deciding what Bitcoin should be, it's everybody in the ecosystem needs to decide, how is Bitcoin evolve and what's it going to be.
Yeah, although you should be careful what you wish for.
Maybe I should.
Because I guess one of the things that I often state as a concern, but I don't know if you would agree, is when we were building the internet, the businesses got built on top of it relatively slowly. Like we had a good decade before we had hundreds of millions of dollars pointing at us. And so we could kind of fiddle around, and we didn't have money on the network and stuff. But it seems like you've got a bunch of money on the network. You've got $900 million worth of venture money, all riding on making sure that you guys don't screw up and that you kind of listen to some version of what they're saying. I mean, it feels like, from just an organizational perspective, you're not as organized, let's just use that word, as the internet was when it had $900 million worth of venture money on it. How does that make you feel, and what's the plan?
That makes me feel incredibly uncomfortable. And I'm sure Vlad feels the same way, right? He's in the seat that I was in there's this huge industry kind of resting on your shoulders, and you do have a huge responsibility not to screw it up, and yet, one way to screw it up is to just not do anything, right? It does have to evolve. And it has been an incredibly short period of time that we've gotten as far as we've gotten. And so we need to grow up fast. And again, I'm always looking for role models and advice on what's the best way to grow up fast.
Vlad, did you want to say something? No.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. So much, responsibility in that regard. But I'm mostly concerned with keeping the software running and improving the software, and not the network itself, the high-level parts.
And finding ways of distributing that responsibility, I think we need to get better at doing that. Mm-hmm. That's part of the reason why I think we need to evolve beyond just one true implementation, one true piece of code. I think that would help a lot to kind of distribute the responsibility. If there were multiple implementations that people were using, then any one implementation screwing up is not going to take down the entire network, right? If there's a bug in the networking code of one implementation, okay, part of the network goes down, but not the entire network, which is, one of the things that kept me up at night as a lead maintainer.
There are efforts at the moment to break core up into more manageable chunks than we have now. Because one of the things that really bothers me the most about the core development process is that, in a lot of ways, you have to be an expert of the entire system. You have to know everything in order to make a small change. Because But what Satoshi left us was kind of messy. It was, you know, everything in one place, and it's gotten messier over time. So being able to, you know, it's hard to find an expert in one area and say, fix this or take a look at this, because as soon as they get in there, they realize that by changing this, I'm going to mess up this other thing that I don't fully understand.
Even worse, you don't realize that you mess up some other thing.
Right. So I think it is very possible as a step towards ending up with a less IE6 landscape like we have now would be to kind of funnel things off into more manageable chunks and let them exist on their own a little bit.
So, like, where do most of the core developers and the developers who are actually participating come from, and do you think that pipeline, I mean, and it ties to kind of what the role of MIT and academia is, because I remember with the internet, there are so many of the protocols that were designed because academia was using the internet for all kinds of stuff, and then eventually businesses started using it. And I remember the day that a colonel, I can't remember his name, came in and sort of banned commercial use of the academic internet, which actually was interesting because it caused a fork, and then it evolved and did interesting things. But academia, because it was using itself, contributed a lot. But I think in the case of Bitcoin, we kind of have to nudge it together, and having the three of you guys having appointments here is like the first step for us. But how do you see like where the developers are coming from in the role of academia, and how is it compared to what it is now?
I think MIT can play a large role in doing academic research, for example, improving the privacy, the scalability, wallet security, all kinds of computer security concerns. That's are also part of Bitcoin. So.
I think one of the interesting rules of academia is definitely the research and testing and coming up with numbers and being able to, in some sense, prove something. We don't see enough of that in the Bitcoin world. There's a lot of emotion, or I know this is best. Well, I don't know why everybody doesn't see this yet, but it's clearly the best. It's a lot easier to, you know, when you can assign numbers and say this is, you know, it was a 6 before, now it's a 12. Clearly this is better. So there's a lot of room for research and study, I think, and it's also important to have you know, neutral is kind of a charged word, which is ironic, but a neutral place for people to be where they're not necessarily having to work around an agenda, even if it's a perfectly reasonable or legitimate one. You know, a place for someone to like ourselves. We're very fortunate to be able to just work on what we think is worth working on, as opposed to being pressured by, you know, whatever the self-interest of the company that you're hired to work on Bitcoin for would be.
I mean, you asked where developers come from. It's really varied. I think we're maturing a little bit in that I don't know, we'll see. It felt like we were getting a lot of, you know, grad students, even some undergrads who thought it was a cool open source software project, and maybe they'll learn C++ by contributing to Bitcoin Core, which is a little bit scary because we're kind of security critical
they should
software.
learn it first, and then
they should
bring better C++ to Bitcoin Core would be nice.
It wasn't always true. I think I've seen a little bit of an evolution towards kind of more professional programmers who've been programming for a long time and either work for Bitcoin businesses or just like the idea of Bitcoin, and so I think we're seeing a little bit of a kind of maturation in the kind of developer that's contributing to core. I think that's a good thing. I think that will probably continue, and you probably saw this with the internet too, right? You probably started with academics, and then it was a lot more people at companies that were contributing to standards and you know, evolving the protocol. So I imagine we'll see that same type of evolution going forward.
As this discussion with Warren Tagami, he works for Blockstream and thinks a lot about this kind of thing. He likes to compare it to the Linux kernel and its evolution. I think that's apt, because I think that would be a great way.
Well, Warren's a good example of, like, he was lead of the Fedora project, right? This huge open source software. He's now working on Bitcoin.
Right.
We've seen like Bram Cohen, you know, BitTorrent guy, is now pretty interested in Bitcoin and is, you know, contributing ideas. He hasn't contributed any code yet. But I think that's an example, you know, a couple good examples of as Bitcoin gets a higher profile, we're seeing kind of higher profile people and people who've had more experience either in open source software projects or other very successful software projects contributing.
And yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard to model every kind of, let's call it an attack, but like damage that could happen to the process. But I think the funny thing about the internet, there's different layers, but I feel like it was more misinformation and stupidity that caused damage in many cases than somebody actually trying to take over. Because you can usually identify and deal with people with bad agendas relatively well if you have a community, but like, you know, when AOL first connected to the internet and stuff like that, it was kind of like a denial of service that was really hard. And I think like this block size one with, as you're saying, all these other people just chiming in, creating this noise is actually the kind of denial of service attack that's harder. I guess though, the bar to be a developer is high enough that it's not like you're gonna see everybody coming in like Wikipedia.
Well, the bar to try to be a developer is very low, actually. Anybody can submit a pull request. And we do see some very naive pull requests. The bar to actually get code into core is pretty high, right? You need to have good tests. You need to have a good reason for doing what you're doing. You need to be willing to stick it out and go through the whole code review process and get people to actually review your code, which is usually the hardest part, to actually get people's attention.
And be pretty thick-skinned and willing to argue and fight for it too, because you know it's not necessarily a welcoming. We have code and parts of the things that we just don't want to touch or change. So if you're trying to touch those things, you better come prepared.
Do you see that blog post recently of Linus shredding a guy for a really bad pull request? I don't know if you saw it. You should look it up. It's really, really scary. It would make anyone think twice before contributing. But
that's actually another reason why I'd like to see multiple implementations, just because then different projects can have different cultures, and maybe there's a Linus culture where it's very rough and tumble, and you'll just get shredded for making a mistake, and maybe there'll be a friendlier, happier, more welcoming.
The happy Bitcoin.
Happy Bitcoin, where maybe the consensus code is never touched, but other changes, and that could be a good way to get your feet wet. I think we need to get there.
Yeah.
We have a problem. I think with we're very English language focused, and so if you don't speak English, you're going to have a hard time contributing to Bitcoin right now, and I think we need to evolve beyond that, so that maybe there are projects in other countries that the culture is speaking a different language. I think that would be great.
I remember having to go onto WeChat to talk to the Chinese miners.
That's been a problem, and that's actually, so we have an event coming up in Hong Kong for exactly that reason. That's trying to push people to China, trying to encourage both sides to come together a little bit, because we're very much in our own bubbles, I think, and that's.
And I think that's probably the biggest failure of the internet and ICANN was giving the U.S. government this real or perceived control over, like, the fact that it was here, and I think it's continues to be a problem. And so hopefully with Bitcoin we had Montreal, we have Hong Kong. If we can keep this international, I think it would be much easier later to bring these guys on board. But Cory, you mentioned as a role of academia sort of testing, and I guess one of the questions though is with Bitcoin, there's only so much you can test formally as just like a formal proof, right? I mean, a lot of this depends on how people use it, on sort of the environment that it's deployed in, right? I mean, is there an easy way to sort of break out what you think would be useful areas for MIT to be focusing on that you can't currently do or don't do enough?
I think a lot of the networking stuff could be easily tested. There are. I think Gavin mentioned the peer-to-peer protocol is pretty rough as it is. It's evolved. It's just been stuff just tacked on over time, really, without much, without a ton of foresight, I think, in a lot of cases. So, in some ways, kind of a rewrite, looking at it with fresh eyes would be a great thing. And even just for someone to come along and do that and say, starting from scratch, here's how I would do it, not necessarily with any plans of trying to move everyone to that, but to be able to show some numbers. This is how it could look, you know, if we with an optimal rewrite versus what we have now. Again, numbers.
You
would
mean
be
a
very helpful on
rewrite
page.
of the protocol, not of the networking code, or both? Oh, yeah.
Vlad, I couldn't hear you. Can you say that again?
You mean a rewrite of the protocol to design a new protocol?
Yeah, I'd like to. I'm actually thinking hard about if we were to rewrite the peer-to-peer protocol, what would it look like?
Yes.
Because I think we can do a much, much better job of getting information across the peer-to-peer network. And I think that's actually it's not a consensus level change, which is fantastic. It's not an either or. We can have both protocols running.
Yes.
And so, you know, that's what I've been thinking about a lot recently. That there's actually a group at Cornell that has a Bitcoin network simulator that I've just started to play with. So they have I think they have like 3,000 node simulation of the Bitcoin network. There's also a simulator called Shadow, I believe, that I haven't played with yet. It's another academic research project to kind of simulate networks. And so what I've been thinking about recently is, you know, again, reading research papers on gossip protocols and then thinking about, all right, well, what metrics do we need to decide, is this protocol better than the one we have now? What should we measure? How should we measure it? What tools do we have? And so I think that is exactly the kind of thing where, you know, working with an academic research group could be fantastic and could have huge benefits.
I mean, in a sense, I mean, we haven't announced this officially, I guess, but I guess we did in the blog post. The three of you work for MIT, although your job description is keep doing whatever you were doing. So, but we hope that you use this affiliation as a way to influence us, you know. And so, I mean, I think this is kind of maybe will be the first of others. But I mean, I think it would be great if you could advise students and help them, you know, learn, point them into things, because I think there's like this interesting tension at MIT or most academic institutions where you have research, you have academics, and the academics are sort of the degree granting process, and the research is sort of the projects, and they're usually separated like church and state. The good thing about the Media Lab is we have the academic program inside of the research, so we make the research the academics, so there's a little less tension, but I think it's important to sort of make sure that the projects that our students are working on are both academically interesting, but fundamentally useful, you know, and I think and I think also talking to some of our kids will be interesting because some of the groups are doing really interesting ways of doing testing or doing modeling or game theory and stuff like that. So there may be some things that might seem difficult to test abstractly, but turns out maybe there is a way to do that. So I'd love for you guys to have that conversation. And I'm going to ask a couple questions from Twitter, but also open it up to the floor because we have about 3 minutes left. One question I think I already know the answer to, but I'm going to ask you guys because it came from Twitter is, do you see sort of Ethereum and other coins as like, is that competition and is that good? And how do you think about sort of non-Bitcoin digital currencies? I guess would be a broad way
to take that.
I don't think that there's necessarily any competition. It would be, I might be alone there, but ultimately the one that's whatever turns out to be the most interesting, the most popular, the most bootstrapped, which is what Bitcoin by far has going for it, is the most interesting to me. So if another comes along that is technically better and you know deserves adoption, then I think it's worth evaluating on its face for that reason. But for the most part, you know, the goal of lots of these different models and tests is to kind of eventually become a part of Bitcoin in some way, because they need to take advantage of the fact that we are bootstrapped, we are known, deployed, used. So I guess that's as much of an answer as I can give there.
I think it is good to explore different ideas, and in a way, those different systems allow exploring different ideas without having to contribute everything, put everything into Bitcoin Core.
I think that's right. And I think if they are different ideas, then it's great. I think the problem with a lot of altcoins is they're not different ideas. They're the same
absolutely.
idea.
Changing a 10 to a 2.
And that I see as bad competition. I think it just kind of takes mind share, takes developers, takes people doing work for no good reason. And some of them are just out and out scams.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, if you want to experiment with a cool new idea using blockchain technology, then go for it. I mean, if the idea is just, I want a digital currency, I think Bitcoin is that idea. I don't think there's any reason to deploy a system that's yet another currency.
Are there any questions out here? Otherwise, I'll keep asking from here. Oh, there's one up front.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. So as students at MIT that are getting involved in Bitcoin, we're sometimes asked to be evangelists for the protocol. So the way we typically sell it is that it's this beautiful, decentralized, trustless system. And then we often sometimes get questions about, well, maybe it's more centralized than we think because of the mining pools that are actually gaining a lot of power, or just a few miners that have a lot of collective power on the network, or even Bitcoin Core being focused on just a few figures. So how do you guys think about that balance between being decentralized and trustless, and then the reality of Bitcoin maybe being a little bit more centralized?
The mining centralization, I actually get asked that question a lot. And I think mining centralization is going to go in waves. I think it'll centralize, and we've been in pretty central place as we've had this huge rush to get to the latest chip technology. If you have access to the latest, what are we down to, 11 nanometer or whatever it is? I'm not a hardware guy, I'm a software guy. If you had access to that hardware early, then you had a big advantage and you could make more money than somebody who didn't have access to that. We're hitting the bottom pretty quick, and I think we will see the commoditization of mining. And we're seeing that actually 21 just this week announced these little boxes they're giving to developers to mine Bitcoins and then do interesting things with the Bitcoins that are mined. And the idea is that consumer devices will plug into the wall and use a little bit of electricity and give you a steady trickle of Bitcoin income that you then kind of spend somehow. It's up to developers to figure out how. And I like that vision. Whether it works or not, who knows? But I think that's a good example of kind of mining becoming less centralized. And I've been saying for years I want to buy a Bitcoin mining electric blanket because it gets cold here in the winter. And why not? I mean, I'm heating my bed and my body at night. I might as well generate a little trickle of Bitcoin, right? It's waste heat, free electricity. Somebody should implement that here at the Media Lab. That would be awesome. I'd buy one. So I think as mining becomes commoditized, it will decentralize again. I might be wrong. Maybe it will always be huge Bitcoin miners sitting next to hydroelectric plants in China or in Iceland, but I don't think so. I think it will. As for kind of centralization of the software, I do think that is evolving, and I don't think it'll continue to evolve. And I think everybody involved in developing the software wants to see that happen. And so, we are doing things like, I say we, not me, other people are doing things to kind of break out the consensus level code so that can be reused as a library, and these other kinds of things. Because we really don't want control. I mean, that's the funny thing. I think none of the people who have some control now really want that control. And I think if you speak to pretty much anybody in the Bitcoin ecosystem, right, we are all bought into the idea of this decentralized system that nobody controls.
Yes, it's a challenge to make things more decentralized.
It's a challenge in that it's difficult, or it's what you're challenging that's your goal, or both?
Well, that's my goal. Okay. Yes.
Okay, I've got one from Twitter. I won't ask you about how it will help the refugee crisis, but I will ask you, how about opinions on future of proof-of-work network-specific hardware, unique consensus challenges on this?
Wait, ask that again.
Opinions on future of proof-of-work, network-specific hardware. I would throw in ASICs and stuff like that, but and unique consensus challenges on this.
So the consensus challenge is one of my favorite topics because it's one that is so kind of rough to wrap your head around at first. The challenge of writing good consensus code, and I assume that's kind of what the question meant. It requires a different process for writing code, and what it essentially does is violates all existing rules of computer science and writing code. You know, a perfect example: don't reuse code like you've been told to do over and over. Copy and paste instead, which is, you know, the wrong answer. Everyone here would tell you that's absolutely the wrong answer. You don't copy and paste code. You modularize and refactor. So it's a very non-obvious challenge sometimes.
So why do you copy paste, not refactor?
Because the risk is that you, in refactoring something, you make a tiny mistake that you don't necessarily realize, and end up doing something different than what you think you're doing. Whereas if you copy and paste, you know, you change the number in only one place, and rather than refactoring so that it's derived in two places. So there are a lot of interesting things like that that you have to do in order to maintain consensus, and that's one of the things that makes writing Bitcoin core or Bitcoin software in general so hard, and that's one of the main reasons that there is one true implementation, because it's nearly impossible to, you have to write bugs on purpose. You have to do things wrong on purpose in order to
bug compatibility is
to maintain consensus, and that's just strange. It's hard for new developers or even very seasoned developers to get their heads around. So I think that's one of the reasons that the one true implementation has stayed around as long as it has.
It is getting better. We have tools to, you know, check for consensus bugs, and we hope to make those tools better over time, so more and more can be checked automatically to make sure that, you know, we don't accidentally upgrade some library that we depend on and then introduce some nasty consensus level bug. The proof of work question I actually find really interesting. I think this is another area where academics are doing work and could do more work on, you know, is proof of work the future of Bitcoin consensus, or will something else start to come in to maybe augment proof of work to help make the network more secure? I think I have an unpopular opinion, maybe, that I think proof of work is not the be-all, end-all of consensus systems. I think it's a fantastic way for distributing coins as fairly as we know how. But I think for actually securing the network, that, you know, introducing something else might make sense. I don't think we know what that something else is yet.
The problem is, yeah, exactly.
But I think there is interesting academic research to do there. That, you know, maybe there is some way of getting around the 51% attack by augmenting proof of work with proof of, you know, I've been on the network for 2 years and therefore you can trust me. I'm not, you know, trustworthiness just based on the fact of longevity, or, you know, some other notion. Because we have, you know, if you look at other parts of the internet comes to consensus on things like routing without proof of work, right? And so looking at, you know, other systems that do manage to come to consensus, I think could help Bitcoin.
How are Bitcoin Core developers compensated? Who actually pays for your work?
Well, for us three, it's joy.
Yes.
But I think are you guys how many of the Bitcoin Core developers are at academic institutions and then the rest are at companies? I don't know.
So Jeff Garzik right now is independent, I believe. He was being paid by BitPay.
Okay.
But now he's independent. They're starting up a company called Block. So he will be founder of his own Bitcoin-related company. Peter and Greg are founders of Blockstream, which is another Bitcoin startup company. And then we've had, close to 300 contributors, which range all the way from, there's probably high school students who have contributed to Bitcoin Core, all the way up through people working at Bitcoin companies. You know, we just have a very wide diversity of people who've contributed to the software, not even counting all of the other Bitcoin projects that go on in the world. You know, it's not just Bitcoin Core, there are all sorts of wallet projects. There's mining software that's I don't know, how the mining software people are compensated. I think most of those are volunteers.
But it sounds like, so academia though is pretty small in terms of your core contributors, the top 20 or so?
I think so, yeah.
Yes.
I'm struggling to think of any of the major contributors who are in academia beyond MIT at the moment. I'm sure there are plenty who contribute, but as far as the steady involvement,
There's a weird, getting academics to contribute is a little bit hard because often, the impetus is to write enough code to prove that your paper is correct, and then you're done and you move on to the next paper.
Yeah.
And if you actually want your code to get into core, you need kind of a longer term perspective than just what do I need to do to get the paper out.
Yeah. I think academia often spins out, or like Kerberos and others, where you see things start in academia and then they get out. But I think there is enough room in academia for work by people who aren't necessarily just focused on their papers, but it's hard. I think a lot of the stuff that MIT built, we built for our own operational needs, and they were built not just by grad students but by staff as well.
So you're saying we need a MIT payroll office to pay us in Bitcoin, and then
exactly.
we can get academics working on.
Actually, that's...
So to expand on that a little bit, though, I think that it's also worth noting that there are plenty of people who devote lots of time and energy to Bitcoin and even to Bitcoin Core without necessarily writing code. I think Greg Maxwell is a pretty good example. As far as lines of code written, you would probably have to go way down in the stats to find him, I would guess. But he is a huge part of what is Bitcoin today. So there's plenty of room for thinkers and people just doing experiments or even thought experiments, but being willing to carry through and kind of fight for them.
So that might also be a helpful exercise for you guys to help us with, is to identify not just the technical, but maybe technical in different ways, pieces of the ecosystem that we can contribute, because obviously we have CSAIL and we have the computer science and the network guys, but we also have an interesting group of economists here with Simon Johnson and others, and we've got people who work on things like consensus and game theory and stuff like that. So it'd be interesting to see some of the tools that we have that we might be able to point at stuff that would be useful. We talked about this already, but also just I had a question. So if you're talking about changing proof of work, right? So you have the current Bitcoin core and the sort of the canonical blockchain. But one of the things that I've heard about, even just changing the hashing, is the fear of fiddling with the thing that everything is running on. How do you test, innovate, play with things that are pretty fundamental? Is there? Because there's side chains, there's other things. What do you think the sandbox is going to look like for trying these new things?
A sandbox is kind of hard because it in a lot of ways, what you really want to measure is real-world utility of the thing. Yeah. So that's a really hard question.
But I guess isn't that also one of the problems with innovating on Bitcoin, is the fact that you are at risk of screwing up a lot of things when you try something, so you can't be as risk-taking as...
Absolutely, there's a balance, right? When you're working on security-critical software like Bitcoin, you want there to be money at stake. Otherwise, people are not going to attack your system. Right? We do have a Bitcoin test net. We can test things there, and we actually are testing things there. But anything that involves actual, funds at risk, nothing will attract a hacker more than $1 million sitting, ready to be stolen. And to get there is hard in a testing environment, right? If there's nothing at stake, it's hard to kind of get the scrutiny that you get on the real Bitcoin network, where there's millions, hundreds of millions of dollars potentially at stake. So I don't think that's a solved problem. Maybe there are things that could be done with side chains that actually have a significant amount of value on them. or maybe contests where you award bounties for finding bugs, for finding breaks in things. Again, I look to other places where this is a problem, like corporate security environments where they give pwn to own, kind of contests or bug bounties or things like that. And I think all of those things are great ideas, and all of those things should be tried. And as the Bitcoin industry matures, and it's not full of startups who are 3 months away from running out of cash, maybe some of those things will actually get funded and will actually be able to happen.
There's been a lot of press around the interest in the financial services sector in Bitcoin. But are there other industries where you're starting to see an emerging interest in Bitcoin, or, as the recent cover in The Economist talked about, in blockchain?
Industries other than financial services that have lots of interest in Bitcoin? I'm not seeing a huge amount of interest. There are experiments that are happening for things like, property records or other kinds of transactions. I know lots of people are talking about Internet of Things and having things that have Bitcoin and use Bitcoin to negotiate their way through the world. But not the, I think kind of the white hot interest right now is the financial industry, who sees kind of short-term benefits using blockchain technology to get rid of a bunch of middlemen and save a bunch of money. So we'll see. I don't know if you guys seen any.
Pretty much what you said. There are, the storage of facts, the time stamping, that kind of thing. But I haven't seen anything, enough to call a killer app, enough to be all that interesting when it's really interesting as a currency.
Vlad, did you have?
No, me neither.
Yeah, we need it. Yeah, it reminds me of before we had all, I remember when I was working on my first ISP, we didn't have the web, and we didn't have all these things.
You weren't thinking Facebook would be a big thing?
And the thing is, this is just it's not necessarily that history is going to repeat itself, but almost every interesting thing that happened wasn't one of the things that we sort of thought was going to happen. And actually, the first thing that I thought was going to happen was digital currency. And it took, 30 years or whatever for it to happen. So.
Speaking of digital currency, one of the trends we're seeing is more and more societies moving towards a cashless society, and I think Scandinavia is sort of leading the charge there. Earlier this year, there was some requests by the UK Treasury about digital currencies. And one of the comments that came back was the idea that the UK should create their own version of Bitcoin or their own digital currency. Is that something that's feasible, and is that something that the Bitcoin community would support?
It's hard to really lump the Bitcoin community into one blob that way. But I would say it was that would be an interesting thing. I mean, the bootstrapping is harder than it seems. It takes a lot to actually get to the point where Bitcoin is, for better or worse. So it does seem like it would be a shame to. I would be curious as to what the reason for not using Bitcoin itself would be. And I mean, some of those reasons would probably be pretty obvious. They would want to exert some kind of control or some sort of regulation or something like that. But at that point, you got to be asking, is this really the right fit then? So, I think it would be great to see as an experiment, great to see it, however it unfolded.
I think that's actually a big risk to Bitcoin. I think if a government took Bitcoin and said, we love this permissionless system for financial innovation, and we're just going to create a bunch of miners, and we're going to create our own inner Elbonia coin, that's going to be used as the legal tender for inner Elbonia. I think that's actually a pretty big risk to Bitcoin. I think that could take off, especially if inner Elbonia was, open-minded enough to invite Outer Albonia and a couple other countries to participate, right? It would be like a euro for the modern digital internet age.
But wouldn't it be more enlightened for them if you're some little country to just like jump in and take
Bitcoin
over
bandwagon?
Because I don't know what it would cost to buy enough mining equipment to take a substantial chunk, but not a lot in this context of a national currency. And so I think it's more out of ignorance that they're not trying to infiltrate the existing Bitcoin system and trying to go out on their own is my guess. And I think, if you, again, to use the internet as a metaphor, when the internet was really kind of launching and with the same issues of it looking like an American technology, I remember the Europeans just said, no, we're not doing it. And so they ran X25. And then the Japanese said, no, we're not doing it, but they did it, which is very typical Japanese. But it was interesting to see kind of all the other people who tried to make their own network because they didn't want to use the American one eventually succumb once it became a standard. And I think that if I were able to sit in front of anybody who's thinking about making it a national currency, this is like the perfect time to put together a mining farm and just put somehow, and there are a bunch of different ways you could do this, I think, but to use the existing blockchain to create you could either create a version of your own currency on it or adopt it directly. But I think one of the biggest problems, or one of the biggest interesting points about Bitcoin is because no country has adopted it, it isn't a currency. So from a tax perspective, it's a little bit tricky. And if it became a currency, it would have some downside, but it would have a lot of upside. And so
actually, the European court.
That's true. That's right.
Said that it is it's not legal tender, but it is a currency over there.
But if a country accepted it as its own currency, then there would be no argument from the U.S. and others. Right now, the problem is every country is going to come up with their own interpretation of what it is, and it's going to be really screwed up because it already is sort of, right. But I think we're running out of time. We have one more question there. I think Des.
The law. So one thing is, I've definitely been noticing an uptick in bar associations and even at a huge unconference in California about a month ago with adoption and interest. I shouldn't say adoption, let's say experimentation with blockchain technologies and smart contracts, I think, is the pointy end of that. So there's one early indicator of a sector that's shown real interest. In line with that, my question though was, this weekend we're having a hackathon here, like right here in this room, Future Commerce Hackathon and Unconference, and it's going to be very participatory in terms of what we deal with. Can you suggest any hard problems that need hacking that we might want to be putting on everyone's agenda to look at with respect to Bitcoin and blockchain?
I don't know. I'm an old curmudgeon when it comes to hackathons. I'm actually not crazy about hackathons as a way of producing good code. They're a great way of having fun, coming together, and doing cool stuff.
So I'm the opposite. I like hackathons. However, Bitcoin is very poorly suited for hackathons in that there's not much you can knock out in an hour. Most things, like I hesitate to bring it back up again, but it's people don't realize that the block size debate, the block size proposal, the code changes. It's like, in some cases 20 lines of code to actually change it to match the proposal. Some of them are very simple. So as far as hacking on something in code, and I don't know if that's what you meant, or if you meant more of like a back and forth kind of arguing, but there aren't many things that you can knock out quickly.
The first days in Unconference, where there'll be discussions, when we've got policymakers and lawyers, mostly technologists, you could absolutely talk about a research agenda or hacking, like longer-term projects, research, people's master's thesis in some case, or semester-long projects on Friday. Saturday, Sunday is a normal hackathon where we're just rolling up our sleeves and seeing what we can do. So both, I guess.
Right. I've struggled with that as well. So we have one. We have a Hong Kong conference coming up, and there are a few days afterwards where it's essentially everyone who is still there at the conference. We have a room. You're invited. and I spent a long time trying to decide what the topic should be, what we should go over, what we should aim to try to knock out, and ultimately I decided everybody will be in a room, do whatever you feel like. Just because it's so hard to try to commit to something and say we really can knock this out. I think that's just overambitious.
I mean, for things that we work on at the pretty low level, consensus level, you need to stare at the code for 6 months and really think hard about it, and get into the mindset of we need to be bug compatible, and it's hard at that level. I mean, I think for a hackathon, doing cool uses of Bitcoin, maybe some Internet of Things, something.
I think it depends on the layer, right?
It does depend on the layer.
Because we never had BGP hackathons, but we had hackathons for apps, right? And
one approach definitely might be, very much depending on the layer, but taking bug reports, trying to track down a bug and have a competition who can squash the most bugs while you're here, because those are, if you look at GitHub, sadly there are hundreds of them, and at varying degrees of difficulty. Some are wish lists, that's bug, transactions take too long to verify, or why 10 minutes? So, that's not obviously hackathon material, but crash when this happens, that seems pretty well suited.
Bug squash-a-thon.
Right.
Would be helpful for you.
I'd vote for that.
All right, well, we run out of time, but thank you guys a lot. This has been really helpful, and this is I know for some of the people this was quite technical, and we didn't answer some of the questions at the different layers, but we usually don't get 3 of the core developers together, so I thought this was important to focus on the technical stuff. But hopefully you guys will be back and interacting with us through hackathons or otherwise, and look forward to working with you guys. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.